The grand hall of the Boston Museum of Natural History was alive with flickering candlelight, each flame trembling against the polished marble floors as murmurs swirled through the crowd. Claire Lawson stood at the edge of the assembly, her hands pressed lightly against the velvet folds of her dark green gown, heart quickening beneath its composed exterior. The whispers came from every direction, barely audible, yet sharp enough to prick her awareness. She does not belong here. Who would ever claim her? One particularly pointed comment brushed against her ears like a knife. You do not belong here. Yet something about you intrigues me. The words were soft, yet carried an unspoken weight that made her glance up, scanning the hall while keeping her back straight, shoulders squared, and eyes calm despite the flutter of nerves within her chest. Across the room, Damien Cross, the Alpha King, stood in quiet control at the elevated dais, his black cloak sweeping behind him like liquid shadow. He moved with the certainty of someone unchallenged, every motion precise, every glance deliberate. Yet as he surveyed the gathered candidates, his gaze paused just a fraction longer on Claire. She caught the subtle flicker of recognition in his silver eyes before he masked it again, the brief hold sending a current of tension through her, unbidden and electric. Candlelight danced across his sharp features, the flame reflecting off the dark fabric of his cloak, casting elongated shadows that stretched toward her as though drawn by an invisible thread. The social pressure in the hall pressed against her in waves. Noble observers leaned closer, murmuring speculations, their gazes darting between her and the Alpha. Each whisper felt like a tangible weight against her composure, yet she held herself steady, allowing her posture and the faint rise and fall of her chest to project an illusion of calm mastery. Her hands clutched the edges of her gown lightly, fingers brushing against the soft fabric, as she navigated the current of scrutiny that seemed almost physical. She inhaled, slow and deliberate, letting the scent of beeswax from the candles and the faint musk of the winter evening settle around her, anchoring herself in the sensory reality of the room. Her pulse pounded in time with the soft echoes of distant footsteps and hushed voices, a quiet symphony of expectation that surrounded the ceremony. The Alpha King's attention, though brief, felt singular in the cacophony. Each calculated glance was a probe, a measurement of her presence, her worth, and perhaps her courage. Claire's heart fluttered, caught between fear and an unspoken curiosity that mirrored his own, yet she did not allow her composure to falter. She adjusted the velvet folds of her gown, letting her fingers linger momentarily over the fabric, as if reaffirming her own presence in the hall. The candle flames reflected in her eyes, shimmering gold and green in the dim space, creating a visual pulse of vulnerability and resilience intertwined. All around her, the assembly awaited the Alpha King's choice, the tension thick enough to taste. Each silent breath, each carefully measured step of Damien's as he surveyed the candidates, amplified the gravity of the moment. Claire's thoughts raced and slowed in the same instant, a dissonant harmony of anticipation and restraint. She felt the electric hum of curiosity, both her own and that projected by every pair of watchful eyes, coalescing into a weight she carried alone, yet with an emerging awareness that something unseen, yet palpably present, had fixed its regard upon her. Her composure became a deliberate performance, a dance of stillness and tension, as she waited for the next movement, the next word, the next subtle shift in the Alpha's posture that might reveal whether she was nothing or everything in his world. The murmurs, the flickering flames, the distant echo of ceremonial steps, each layer coalesced into a suspended moment, rich with cinematic anticipation, the audience drawn into every careful gesture, every half-glance, leaving the question unresolved. Would she merely pass through the ceremony unnoticed, or would this fleeting observation by the Alpha King ignite a path neither of them had yet imagined? The grand hall's murmur seemed to swell with each passing second, a low tide of expectation and hushed commentary that pressed against Claire's composure. Damien Cross, standing at the dais, adjusted the cuffs of his cloak with a precision that spoke of authority, but the faint twitch in his jaw betrayed the flicker of curiosity ignited by Claire's quiet presence. He had observed her from the beginning, yet something about her composure under scrutiny unsettled the calculated distance he maintained with all others. Across the hall, noble observers shifted uneasily, some leaning closer, whispering as if sharing a secret with the air itself. Unlikely, and yet I cannot look away, Damien murmured under his breath, the low cadence of his voice lost to the din yet powerful in its internal reverberation. Claire's fingers tightened against the edge of her gown, sensing the imperceptible weight of his attention even without direct acknowledgement. The tension in the room became almost tactile. Every whisper, every footstep on the marble floor, every fluttering of silk created a resonance that pressed against her chest. The flickering candlelight cast moving shadows across the polished surfaces, elongating figures, creating a rhythm of anticipation that felt almost alive. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun dipped behind gray clouds, scattering a soft, diffuse light across the hall that mingled with the candle glow, painting the scene in muted golds and silvers. In a corner, a rival candidate stumbled, the movement sudden and uncontrolled, eliciting gasps from the surrounding spectators. Without hesitation, Claire stepped forward, her hands brushing against the rival's arm to steady them, a small, deliberate gesture that contrasted sharply with the chaotic flutter of whispered excitement around her. Her touch was precise and measured, offering stability without drawing attention to herself, yet the alpha's gaze found her even in the midst of this minor disturbance. Damien's silver eyes followed her motion with an intensity that was both silent and revealing. The brief arc of her movement etched itself into his awareness, creating an unspoken connection suspended between observation and recognition. Claire's breath caught slightly, the movement of air through her lungs shallow yet steady as she processed the subtle gravity of the moment. The warmth of her own pulse and the cool brush of air through the high-ceilinged hall mingled, creating a sensory tension that mirrored the quiet, electric pull of his gaze. The crowd's attention, momentarily diverted by the incident, shifted back to the candidates, but the space between Claire and Damien seemed to exist outside the rhythm of the assembly. She adjusted her stance, heels pressing against the marble, back straight, shoulders set, a silent acknowledgement that she had noticed his regard without yielding to it. The murmurs of speculation resumed around her, yet she felt an invisible tether, a delicate balance between curiosity and apprehension, binding her to the Alpha King's silent scrutiny. Each flicker of candlelight reflected in her eyes as though mirroring the sparks of attention exchanged across the hall, and she realized with a quiet thrill that the calculated observation she had sensed before was no longer fleeting. Damien's posture remained controlled, cloak sweeping lightly against the stone floor, but the brief softness in his silver gaze lingered like an echo, a silent acknowledgement of her composure and the subtle defiance she carried in a world that had expected her to shrink. The tension between them hummed in the air, unresolved, a cinematic moment pregnant with anticipation, as Claire's hands relaxed ever so slightly while her mind held fast to the awareness that the Alpha King's interest had shifted, however imperceptibly, toward her. The whispers, the shadows, the soft interplay of candlelight and fading afternoon glow, all conspired to hold her in a moment of poised suspense, leaving every observer and Claire herself poised on the precipice of the next move, the next glance, the next measure of courage that could change everything. The hushed murmurs of the hall thickened as Damien Cross, standing with absolute poise at the dais, extended a deliberate gesture toward another candidate, a young woman in a gown of deep crimson, flawless and poised, signaling his intended selection. Claire's chest tightened with the pressure of social expectation, every eye in the room weighing her as she remained rooted in place. "Step aside. This stage is not for you." A sharp voice cut through the murmurs, the words precise and cutting, aimed at her from the assembly's inner circle. She froze for a heartbeat, the cold clarity of the statement settling across her shoulders like a physical weight, yet she did not move. Instead, she inhaled, letting the faint scent of winter air seeping through the tall windows mingle with the candlelit warmth of the hall, grounding her in the moment. The marble beneath her heels felt solid yet alien, each subtle shift of weight a reminder that she was being measured, not just by Damien, but by the scrutiny of every noble observer and rival assembled around her. The rival candidate in crimson approached the dais, their polished shoes echoing softly against the marble, while Claire's hands flexed at her sides, the delicate touch against her gown a silent assertion of composure. Damien's silver eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked briefly to Claire, a subtle acknowledgement that he had noticed her presence, despite the authority figure's command and the crowd's expectation that she would yield. The air seemed to contract around her, the collective breaths of hundreds of spectators forming a quiet current of social pressure. Each flicker of candlelight along the high ceilings cast shadows that danced across the polished surfaces and between the figures, elongating movements and amplifying the tension that tightened Claire's chest. She adjusted her posture imperceptibly, straightening her back, lifting her chin slightly, and folding her hands at the front of her gown with meticulous precision, demonstrating calm that belied the rapid pulse racing beneath her ribs. Damien shifted minutely, the movement subtle yet deliberate, his hand brushing along the edge of the dais, his posture an unspoken measure of authority that seemed to isolate Claire in a small charged orbit within the hall. The murmurs around her grew faint, replaced by the silent gravity of the Alpha King's attention, the ambient candlelight now seeming to spotlight her every motion. The distant ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the hall punctuated the suspended moment, each tick an echo of the anticipation coiling in the air. Claire's eyes flicked toward Damien again, catching the hint of his scrutiny, and she felt the dual weight of fear and fascination pressing together, an unnameable pull that resonated through her very core. She allowed her shoulders to relax just slightly, enough to convey quiet defiance, her gaze steady on the floor ahead, resisting the instinct to shrink, yet fully aware of the magnetic tension threading between her and the Alpha. The hall seemed to pulse around them, the combination of soft murmurs, flickering light, and the silent, controlled movements of the Alpha creating a cinematic space where every glance, breath, and heartbeat was amplified. Claire's composure held, but her awareness of the Alpha's gaze, the public scrutiny, and the ceremonial choreography created a precarious balance. She was simultaneously invisible to some and the focal point of an imperceptible gravitational force that seemed to anchor Damien's attention. As the other candidate reached the dais, and the ceremonial ritual continued its expected course, Claire remained still, suspended in the moment between submission and assertion, her mind a whirl of anticipation and careful calculation. The tension did not break, it thickened, leaving the space between her and Damien charged with expectation and curiosity, unresolved, like the moment just before the first light of dawn brushes a snow-covered skyline, leaving every observer on edge and every pulse quicken with anticipation for what was to come next. Claire's attention shifted subtly, drawn to the soft shuffle of movement at the edge of the hall where a young assistant had faltered, her delicate figure slumping faintly beneath the weight of nerves and exhaustion. She stepped forward instinctively, her hands moving with precise care to steady the trembling form, brushing a stray strand of auburn hair from the assistant's face with a gentle sweep. The warm candlelight caught the sweep of her fingers, highlighting the quiet decisiveness in her motion, while Damien Cross, observing from the dais, allowed his gaze to linger on the interaction just long enough for the nuance to register without breaking his controlled posture. Claire's breath was steady, measured, each exhale deliberate as she assessed the assistant, her eyes reflecting both concern and an unspoken resolve, a combination of empathy and inner strength that had gone unnoticed until this moment. The hall itself seemed to contract around them. Murmurs softened, footsteps momentarily stilled, as if the room acknowledged the subtle act of courage unfolding in the shadows. Outside, the late afternoon light shifted through the tall, arched windows, scattering a soft, silver glow over the polished marble floors and intertwining with the flickering candle flames to create a shifting mosaic of light and shadow that danced across the walls and ceiling. Damien's eyes tracked every motion with an intensity that remained quiet but undeniable, the briefest lift of an eyebrow betraying a flicker of acknowledgement. Claire's hands returned to the assistant's arm with a soft firmness, adjusting posture and lending steadiness, her movements careful and composed, yet charged with the energy of someone fully present and deeply aware of her surroundings. The ambient murmur of the audience seemed to fade further as if their collective attention had been momentarily arrested by the unassuming display of courage, a silent recognition that something remarkable existed beneath the calm exterior. Every subtle gesture, the slight inclination of Claire's head, the way her fingers lingered over the assistant's sleeve, created a visual narrative of competence and care that spoke louder than words. Damien's attention did not waver, the careful assessment of her composure, her quiet decision to act without seeking notice, marked a shift in perception, the first trace of dangerous tenderness stirring within him. Claire's pulse quickened not from fear but from the sudden awareness that her actions were seen, though not by the crowd, by the Alpha King himself, whose presence felt like a gravitational pull even across the distance of the hall. The interplay of candlelight, the subtle movement of her hands, and the reflected silver afternoon light cast an almost cinematic glow around her, each element contributing to the tension that now vibrated between her and Damien, unspoken yet palpable. The assistant straightened slightly under her guidance, and Claire allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible exhale, the brief release of punctuation in the otherwise taut silence. Damien's fingers brushed against the edge of the dais, a restrained movement that conveyed both attention and restraint, his posture taut yet attentive, silently acknowledging the act without any need for overt reaction. As Claire stepped back, maintaining the balance between care and decorum, the hall's murmurs resumed but with a subtle change, as though the space now recognized an unanticipated gravity surrounding her presence. The candle flames reflected in her eyes, shadows playing across the folds of her gown, and the tension that lingered in Damien's stillness combined to leave the moment suspended, unresolved, a delicate cinematic beat that threaded anticipation and curiosity through the audience, and through Claire herself, leaving every observer poised on the edge of the next unfolding revelation, uncertain of the significance yet drawn inexorably toward it. Damien Cross's gaze lingered on Claire longer than anyone in the hall could discern, a quiet intensity that rippled beneath the surface of his composed exterior. His silver eyes tracked the subtle line of her posture, the gentle lift of her chin, the way her hands flexed at the edge of her gown as if bracing against the weight of the room's scrutiny. "So composed even here," he murmured under his breath, barely audible over the soft hum of whispers and shifting feet around them. The candlelight caught the edge of his cloak as he adjusted it with a measured motion, his presence solid and commanding, yet tempered by a restrained fascination that had not been present before. Across the polished marble floor, Claire moved with quiet precision, stepping slightly to allow the rival candidate passage, her movements fluid yet deliberate, each step placing her in the peripheral awareness of the Alpha King. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped further, sending a pale silver wash through the tall arched windows, mingling with the warm candlelight and painting a shifting tapestry of light and shadow across the hall. Damien's eyes followed the play of light across Claire's form, noting how she navigated the space with ease and attention, a small but powerful display of competence and grace that set her apart from all others. The hall's ambient noise seemed to soften around the two of them, a muted silence that heightened the subtle exchange of acknowledgement and curiosity. Claire's breath was steady, controlled, yet her chest hummed with a quiet thrill at the unspoken awareness she felt emanating from him. Each movement she made, the careful tilt of her shoulders, the subtle adjustment of her gown, carried significance in his eyes, a testament to her composed courage and the understated power of her presence. Damien's hand brushed briefly against the edge of the dais as he shifted his weight, a nearly imperceptible gesture that conveyed attention without intrusion, the weight of his focus settling around her like an invisible halo of scrutiny and interest. The flicker of candle flames reflected in his silver eyes, catching the nuances of shadow and movement across the hall, and in that reflection, Claire perceived the faintest trace of admiration, a shift in perception that carried a dangerous tenderness. She allowed herself a slight, controlled exhale, the smallest acknowledgement of relief, as she sensed the gravity of his attention and the subtle shift in the energy that bound them across the room. Around them, the murmurs of the audience resumed, but now tempered with a renewed curiosity, the social dance continuing while an unspoken thread of connection wove silently between the Alpha and her. Damien's gaze remained fixed, quiet but unwavering, measuring, assessing, yet no longer dismissive, and Claire felt the first inkling of a dangerous intrigue, a shift in the balance of perception that had placed her in the center of an invisible spotlight. The hall seemed to hold its collective breath, each flickering shadow, each reflected beam of candlelight and silver afternoon glow amplifying the electric tension suspended in the space between them. Claire's mind raced even as her movements remained poised, her pulse attuned to the silent rhythm of Damien's assessment, and she felt the undeniable pull of attention, curiosity, and cautious admiration, leaving the moment suspended, unresolved, pregnant with anticipation, as if the next glance, the next shift in posture, or the next subtle gesture could alter the course of everything yet to come. The hall's energy shifted subtly as Claire maneuvered through the assembled candidates, her posture deliberate, each movement measured to maintain composure under the crowd's scrutinizing gaze. A ceremonial misstep occurred near the center dais. A decorative scroll slipped from a pedestal, cascading to the polished marble with a muted clatter. Gasps punctuated the room as observers collectively turned their attention to the disruption. Claire moved instinctively, her hands reaching to secure the scroll before it fell completely, her motion precise and unflinching. Damien Cross, standing elevated in his black cloak, allowed his silver eyes to follow her actions, the briefest lift of an eyebrow betraying a flicker of surprise that contrasted with the usual rigidity of his expression. The movement drew a collective murmur from the audience. The juxtaposition of her quiet competence against the expected protocol, creating a moment of social astonishment. Observers whispered behind gloved hands, their curiosity now heightened as attention split between ceremonial error and the unexpected response of the Omega who had been largely overlooked. Claire's pulse quickened beneath her composed exterior, her hands steady as she repositioned the scroll with careful fingers, the candlelight casting dancing shadows across the marble floor and illuminating the subtle tension in her expression. Damien's gaze did not waver. The intensity remained controlled but perceptibly deeper, registering the competence and poise she exhibited. He shifted minutely, adjusting the cloak along his shoulder, a restrained motion that signaled both acknowledgement and intrigue without drawing overt attention. Claire felt the quiet gravity of his observation, a presence that pressed upon her awareness even without words. The ambient murmur of the crowd softened, replaced by the weight of a silent assessment, a tension charged by the contrast between her quiet action and the eyes of the Alpha. Every subtle gesture, the tilt of her head, the steadying of the scroll, the soft inhale she allowed herself after completing the motion, carried significance, a visual and emotional narrative that resonated across the hall. Damien's hand brushed lightly along the dais, a restrained signal of attention and restrained admiration. His posture taut yet attentive, silently measuring the strength, focus, and courage she displayed. Claire's gaze flicked toward him, registering the faint acknowledgement, and she felt a delicate shift in perception, a subtle recalibration in the space between them. The candles reflected in his eyes, flickering shadows tracing contours of his jaw, illuminating the interplay of control and interest that remained tightly held. The audience remained largely unaware of the unspoken exchange, but the room's atmosphere carried a weight that could be felt as Claire and Damien's attention intersected across the distance, a silent and charged acknowledgement of capability, presence, and potential. The tension hung unresolved, the hall alive with both ceremonial expectation and the silent acknowledgement of her emerging significance. Claire's chest rose and fell with deliberate control, her pulse attuned to the quiet rhythm of the Alpha King's gaze, and the hall seemed to suspend itself around them, every whisper, every shadow, every glint of candlelight amplifying the charged connection. Her awareness stretched, poised on the precipice of recognition and social expectation, each motion carefully calibrated against the quiet weight of observation, leaving the moment suspended in cinematic anticipation and unresolved curiosity as the next step in this unfolding ritual remained unspoken but palpably imminent. The hall seemed to contract, the murmur of voices fading as Damien Cross cleared his throat, his cloak sweeping silently behind him, the polished marble reflecting the gold and silver of candlelight like frozen water. "She will stand by my side," he announced, his voice firm and precise, cutting through the whispers that had been circling the room like restless shadows. The statement landed with a weight that shifted the current of attention. Eyes widened, jaws tightened, and a collective pause rippled through the audience. Claire froze mid-step, the words sinking into her awareness, a shockwave that left her chest both tight and strangely buoyant. The ceremonial expectation that she would yield, that she would step aside, dissolved in the space between her and the Alpha King. Around them, noble observers shifted uneasily, some straightening in their seats, others exchanging quick glances, yet the focus remained anchored on the intersection of authority and unexpected choice. Claire's fingers brushed lightly over the edge of her gown, a small, deliberate movement, grounding herself as she processed the full weight of the announcement. The air between her and Damien vibrated with a tension that was both public and intensely private, a charged quiet that held the room at bay. She stepped forward, her heels making a soft tap against the marble, closing the distance between them in a slow, deliberate motion dictated by protocol yet colored by unspoken energy. Damien's eyes followed each step, measured and restrained, his posture taut yet subtly flexible, the cloak brushing along the dais as though it carried his silent acknowledgement and the weight of control alike. Every subtle movement, the slight incline of his shoulder, the careful adjustment of the fold of his cloak, the narrowing of his silver eyes, spoke volumes, communicating recognition, consideration, and a dangerous tenderness that he did not speak aloud. Claire inhaled slowly, sensing the gravity of proximity, the heat of his presence subtly contrasting with the cool marble beneath her feet. The murmurs of the assembly continued in hushed waves, but they felt distant, as if she and Damien existed in a separate plane of attention defined by the gravity of his choice. The flicker of candlelight across her gown and the silver wash of afternoon light through the tall windows cast dynamic shadows that moved with them, the interplay of illumination accentuating the subtle chemistry forming in their space. She lifted her gaze to meet his, holding it just long enough to convey awareness without presumption, and in that moment Damien's silver eyes softened imperceptibly, a near imperceptible shift in expression that carried the weight of quiet approval and attention. The ceremonial proximity forced by his declaration pressed against her, a physical closeness that was new, charged, and unspoken, and Claire felt the subtle pull of anticipation threading through the pause, the cadence of shared breaths and measured steps shaping a tension that was both delicate and formidable. Each flicker of light across his face, each gentle adjustment of posture, each measured step forward was a visual symphony of restraint and attention, the silent acknowledgement of competence, courage, and composure intertwining to create a cinematic tableau alive with emotional resonance. The hall's collective focus had shifted, yet within the stillness between them, an invisible current hummed, connecting them in a taut, delicate balance, unresolved and suspended, leaving Claire's mind alight with curiosity and Damien's controlled posture betraying the first flickers of personal investment, a silent promise of intensity to come in the moments ahead. The hall fell into a near silence as Damien Cross, standing at the elevated dais, swept his gaze across the assembled candidates before letting it settle on Claire with an intensity that seemed to press through the flickering candlelight. "She will stand by my side," he declared, the words firm, measured, and carrying the weight of authority that left no room for hesitation. The effect was instantaneous. Noble onlookers exchanged startled glances, whispers stilled mid-breath, and a charged hush spread through the grand hall. Claire froze, every heartbeat echoing against the polished marble beneath her heels, a mixture of shock and tentative relief settling in her chest. The ceremonial expectation of submission had been upended, and the gravity of the Alpha King's decision left her poised on the edge of disbelief. She inhaled slowly, letting the mingling warmth of candle flames and the cool trace of winter light through the tall windows steady her, while her fingers brushed against the soft fabric of her gown, grounding herself in the moment. Damien's eyes, sharp and silver under the flickering light, tracked her deliberate steps forward, each one measured, respectful, yet imbued with an unspoken current of expectation. The space between them seemed to contract, the ceremonial choreography now amplified by the magnetic tension threading silently across the marble floor. Every movement she made, the subtle adjustment of her shoulders, the soft lifting of her chin, the careful placement of her hands along the folds of her gown, was mirrored in the meticulous observation of the Alpha, whose body language radiated controlled attention, a dangerous tenderness restrained beneath his authoritative exterior. Around them, the murmurs of the assembly continued, yet felt distant, background to the cinematic focus of proximity and awareness that pulsed between Claire and Damien. A faint draft from the tall windows brushed against her hair, and he subtly adjusted the edge of his cloak, a silent act of presence and guardianship that did not break protocol yet signaled attention far beyond what ceremony required. Candlelight flickered across his profile, casting elongated shadows that intertwined visually with her own, highlighting the spatial intimacy forced by his declaration, and the unspoken energy bridging the distance. Claire's pulse quickened as she sensed the pull of expectation, the weight of observation, and the dangerous, quiet approval that shimmered in his restrained posture. She allowed herself the smallest shift forward, enough to close the ceremonial gap yet not enough to break the delicate tension, each movement deliberate, measured against the weight of his gaze and the suspended anticipation in the hall. Damien's silver eyes softened imperceptibly, a subtle acknowledgement of her composure, her courage, and the unanticipated resonance of her presence in his controlled world. The room's shadows danced around them, candlelight painting a cinematic tableau of poised vulnerability, silent challenge, and emerging connection. Every breath, every tilt of the head, every careful step threaded the space with invisible narrative, a tension that was both public and intimately private, leaving the hall in a state of suspended curiosity while the unspoken bond between them deepened, unresolved yet unmistakably present. Claire's awareness sharpened, attuned to the delicate pulse of proximity, the layered intensity of Damien's restraint, and the fragile thrill of acknowledgement, as the ceremonial moment hung in equilibrium, pregnant with anticipation, suspended on the threshold of discovery and connection, leaving every observer, and herself, poised on the edge of what was about to unfold. The winter wind pressed gently against the tall windows of the hall, carrying a whisper of snowflakes that had begun to dust the city streets below, silvering the dark stone outside. Claire felt the faint chill seep through the fabric of her gown, and before she could shiver, Damien Cross stepped closer, his black cloak brushing lightly against her shoulder. "You are safe here," he murmured, his voice low, precise, and intimate, cutting through the lingering hum of the ceremonial crowd as though it existed solely for them. The words hung in the air, weighty and deliberate, and she felt a warmth spread across her chest despite the chill, a quiet anchor in the presence of the alpha's restrained intensity. Her gaze lifted to meet his, catching the faint flicker of candlelight reflected in his silver eyes, a glimmer that softened the severity of his posture without diminishing the quiet authority he exuded. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake catching the fading afternoon light before melting into the darkened streets, a slow, serene rhythm that mirrored the tension suspended between them. Claire's fingers brushed against the edge of her gown as she turned slightly to receive the subtle coverage of his cloak, the fabric warm against her skin, the act both protective and intimate, a gesture that spoke louder than words ever could. Damien's presence pressed against her consciousness, a taut awareness of proximity and controlled attention that threaded through the space around them, carrying a fragile promise in the stillness of movement. Motion, his careful placement of the cloak over her shoulders, the measured step to adjust the fall of its edge, the soft incline of his head toward her, was precise, deliberate, and saturated with unspoken intention. The hall's shadows elongated in the flickering candlelight, curling around the two figures like smoke, enhancing the cinematic frame of quiet intimacy and unacknowledged desire. Claire's breath caught softly, the warmth from the subtle contact mingling with the cold of the room, heightening her awareness of both the public space around them and the private microcosm of interaction she occupied with him. Damien's eyes, still silver and watchful, held hers longer than necessary, scanning, measuring, acknowledging, a nuanced assessment of courage, composure, and vulnerability, each second amplifying the charged anticipation suspended in the air. Around them, the murmurs of observers continued faintly, but the focus of tension had shifted entirely into the delicate orbit shared between Claire and the alpha, a silent dance of presence, restraint, and the first hints of trust. She allowed herself to relax slightly into the gesture of protection, her posture still poised, but her heartbeat quickened as she registered the subtle shift in his attention, the quiet acknowledgement that he saw her not as a candidate or a ceremonial placeholder, but as someone of unexpected worth. Every flicker of candlelight, every whisper of the wind, every brush of fabric against skin became magnified in that moment, creating an intricate cinematic tableau of restrained connection and delicate vulnerability. Claire's mind oscillated between comprehension and anticipation, sensing the near confession suspended in Damien's carefully restrained demeanor, a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying, leaving her poised on the edge of unspoken revelation. The snow outside continued to fall, the dimming afternoon light and golden candle glow painting their silhouettes against the polished marble as the air between them hummed with possibility, unresolved and potent, holding the promise of intimacy, acknowledgement, and the delicate, dangerous unfolding of trust, leaving every breath, every glance, and every heartbeat suspended, a cinematic pause pregnant with curiosity and hesitation, as the next moment, the next word, the next act of care or revelation, remained tantalizingly unclaimed. The ceremonial hall stretched wide beneath towering arched ceilings, sunlight filtering through stained glass in soft, fractured patterns that illuminated the polished marble in hues of amber and gold. Snowflakes drifted outside the massive windows, glinting like scattered diamonds against the winter sky, and the gathered members of the royal council and assembled nobility stood in hushed reverence. Claire stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she held the ancient scroll bearing the sacred bond words, her voice rising steady and clear in the quiet expanse. "By this oath I pledge my heart and my life, bound by destiny to the one whose presence calls me home." Damien Cross, standing at the center dais in his tailored black ceremonial cloak, felt the words resonate through the hall like a pulse, each syllable reaching deep into the measured calm of his silver eyes. A faint shift of emotion brushed his features, a softness underlined by the weight of restraint, but he did not break his composure. He allowed the scroll to lower, his gaze locking with Claire's in a long taut moment where the ceremonial space between them seemed to collapse into a private current of understanding. The Alpha King's lips parted slightly, a whispered affirmation carried only for her. "And I will guard you always." Murmurs rippled through the council as the sacred bond ceremony commenced. Attendants passed ceremonial sigils, candle flames danced across their metallic surfaces, reflecting the delicate arcs of frost gathering on the windows. Claire's pulse raced as Damien descended a single step toward her, closing the remaining distance with careful precision. His hand rose, palm open, and she placed her fingers lightly atop his in a gesture of consent and connection. The hall's silence deepened, broken only by the subtle creak of marble and the distant echo of a solemn organ. As Damien lowered himself to one knee before her, the motion measured, deliberate, emblematic of his protection and choice. The council members inclined their heads in acknowledgement, the room collectively witnessing the symbolic affirmation of her role, her worth, and the inseparable bond now declared under the light of both winter and ritual. Claire felt the warmth of his hand beneath hers, the controlled strength of his presence, the subtle pressure of a silent vow conveyed through body language alone. Her eyes softened, the uncertainty of anticipation replaced by clarity and acceptance. She had chosen to meet destiny with courage, and his acknowledgement mirrored that choice, a quiet surrender of control and mutual respect threading through their connection. Damien's head tilted, his forehead gently brushing against hers, a brief touch heavy with unspoken promise, while the flickering candlelight painted both their faces in an ethereal glow, the snow outside glinting in resonance with the intimacy of the moment. With that single restrained act, the sacred bond was sealed, the ritual complete. The hall seemed to exhale collectively as tension gave way to resolution, and Claire and Damien remained at the center of the room, hands clasped, eyes locked, a tableau of dangerous tenderness, emotional recognition, and fulfilled destiny. The sunlight shifted subtly through the stained glass, scattering across their entwined figures, highlighting the silver in his eyes, the quiet strength in hers, and the completion of a bond that had carried them through fear, hesitation, and ceremonial expectation to a moment of fully realized emotional and romantic resolution, the cinematic resonance of their union lingering like a soft, enduring melody across the polished marble floors and the vaulted ceilings of the sacred hall.